Have you been looking into keeping cichlids but you don't have aquariums of this size? Well, in today's video we're going to walk through some stocking options if you're looking for cichlids for your smaller aquarium sizes. We know that a lot of people may not have the budget or the space to keep a very large cichlid tank, so in today's video we're going to provide some good examples of cichlids you can keep in those smaller tanks. Looking forward to talking about it, so let's dive right in. Just some quick context on what I would consider a small tank. Anything below 40 gallons is going to be a small aquarium when it comes to keeping cichlids. We actually did videos on a 40 gallon, 75, and 125 gallon when it comes to cichlid tank setup options, and we'll leave those down in the description below. But when it comes to your aquariums below 40 gallons, the most common are your 20 gallon, 20 gallon long, 29 gallon tank, and a 33 gallon long, and that's really what we're talking about today. But overall, we really wouldn't recommend any cichlids in a 10 gallon tank long term unless it's just a breeding project or a quarantine tank or just a temporary home, because when it comes to cichlids, even your smaller cichlids, they need territory and space. They will be aggressive if they don't have that space needed, but especially if they get into breeding mode and they don't have the space they need to get away from others in the tank, they'll likely attack or kill some of those tank mates if your tank isn't big enough. So I'm going to be walking through our top 5 cichlid options for small aquariums, but we're going to start with a couple honorable mentions first. So the first cichlid that comes to mind is the keyhole cichlid, because they stay pretty small, about 4 to 5 inches in length, and they're a very peaceful fish even when they're in breeding mode. They are a South American cichlid with a unique pattern having that keyhole dot on their body, but because they still reach that 5-inch range, I would still recommend a slightly larger tank than some of your smaller sizes. I think you could probably get away with a 33 gallon or maybe your 38 gallon tanks with a keyhole, but I just wanted to mention them as one of the first options for some of your smaller to medium sized tanks. And on a similar note, I would recommend the dwarf flag cichlid if you do have any of your tanks in that 30 gallon tank range. They are another dwarf cichlid that is peaceful and doesn't get too big, but they're very similar to the keyhole in that you're really pushing it at less than 30 gallons with these guys, so that's why they're an honorable mention. They're not technically a small tank cichlid. Okay, so coming in at number 5 on the list is actually a cichlid I have not kept before, and that is the golden dwarf cichlid. These are very small South American cichlids, and they're relatively rare, and they have another nickname as the golden eye cichlid. They almost look like a cross between an Apistogramma and electric blue acara, but because they stay pretty small, I think you could keep them in a 20 gallon, a 20 gallon long, especially a 29 gallon. That would be a great tank setup. And although they are pretty rare, I did see them on a couple online websites, including Imperial Tropicals, so if you're looking for something like that, it could be something interesting if you're looking for that centerpiece fish in a 20 gallon tank, for instance, with other smaller community fish. Number 4 on the list is the Kribensis cichlid. Kribensis are very interesting cichlids because they're not like your other African cichlids from the Rift Valley lakes, like your Lake Malawi cichlids that are pretty big and aggressive. The Kribensis stays pretty small at about 3, maybe 4 inches in total length, so you should be able to keep them in a 20 gallon or a 20 gallon long with no real issues. The only real issue is if you had a pair form and they started to breed. They could be pretty aggressive to some of their tank mates, but overall it should be fine. But you could just get one with some other schooling tetras or barbs, and I think it would make for a really good 20 gallon tank. And they make for such a great centerpiece because of their color. It's very unique with the pinks, reds, purples, yellow dots. It's a very unique looking fish that is commonly sold at a lot of your big box stores as well, so you shouldn't have too much issue finding them. It makes for a really good tank option for some of your smaller aquariums. Coming in at number 3 on the list is some of your different ram species. Rams are South American cichlids that again stay pretty small, topping out about 3 inches in total length. And one thing that's really cool about the rams is that there is a variety that you could choose from. Probably the most hardy and most common available is the Bolivian ram. That would be a great choice for someone that's more of a beginner. But if you wanted to look into something like your German blue rams or your electric blue rams, those might be a little more fragile, but they all stay pretty small, and you can definitely get away with a few of these in a 20 gallon or a 29 gallon. A really good tank setup might be a 20 gallon tank with a few rams, maybe a schooling fish like one of your smaller tetras, and then maybe a small school of corridoras or autocinkless catfish. I think that gives you a lot of different elements in the tank, but the ram could still act as that centerpiece that we've been talking about. But similar to the Kribensis and all the other fish on this list is that if you do have a pair form and they start breeding, Some of the other tank mates, like smaller tetras for instance, could be in harm's way if they don't have enough space. So as always, the bigger tank the better, but they definitely could fit in a 20, a 29, or a 33 gallon. Coming in at number 2 is another dwarf species of cichlid, and that is the Apistogramma. I absolutely love the Apistogramma because for a small fish, they're very personable. There's a wide variety of types that you could choose from, so you could really pick what species, what color patterns that you really prefer, and then you could definitely fit these guys in a 20-gallon tank. I had one male in a 10-gallon tank, but once it reached its full size, it definitely didn't feel like a big enough tank for them, so I would recommend a 20-gallon as a minimum tank size for one Apistogramma. But if you wanted to get a pair or maybe a small group, a 20-gallon long would be a great tank setup for Apistos. Similar to the ram, you could pair them with some of your smaller tetras and maybe get a few scavengers at the bottom. You could have a lot going on in that tank, and with both the ram and the Apisto, I would recommend plenty of hiding spots, caves, driftwood, and most importantly, I would add live plants to both of those tanks. It provides a lot of cover for these smaller cichlids and gets them out of hiding just a little bit more. But overall, the Apistogramma is an awesome fish. I would totally recommend it if you have a 20-gallon tank or larger. Okay, so number 1 on the list is the world's smallest cichlid, and that is the African shell dweller. African shell dwellers could probably fit in a 10-gallon tank, but the problem comes in when they start breeding, which they do very often. I'm hot just like an oven. And before long, you might have just too many African shell dwellers in a tank. And I think a 20-gallon long or bigger is the ideal setup for African shell dwellers, so you can have a full community with different territories established. I started with 8 shell dwellers in my 33-gallon tank here, and they were immediately breeding within the shells, which was one of the coolest things about keeping them, is just seeing them interact with their shells, establish their home bases, and start breeding very often within these shells. The tank setup can be very simple, just sand and escargot shells, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, and maybe just a few rocks scattered about, which can divide the line of sight breaks if you have a few different pairs form in your tank. But just keep in mind, these guys will dig through the sand, they will move their shells around, and even if you have a pristine aquascape, it will be moved around significantly with piles of sand and everything moved all over the place. So if you're looking for a very tidy tank, I wouldn't go with the African shell dwellers, but if you don't mind that and you'd rather just watch the very cool cichlid behavior, the African shell dwellers would be a great option. Again, a 20-gallon long would be a great tank size for these guys. You could have a thriving community and it would just be a very interesting tank to watch over time. Okay, so that does it for the list of cichlids you could put in some of your smaller tank sizes. I hope you found that information helpful. If you'd like to see stocking options for your 40-gallon tank, click this video here. Or if you'd like to see cichlid tank setups for a 75-gallon, click this video here. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.